Feel the people power and join us as we tackle the issues impacting our nation as we fight to protect our democracy in our multiracial, working class world. Topics and issues at the top of your mind, the bottom of your wallet, and deep in your soul. Let's talk. Just Solutions on Free Speech TV.
Welcome to another edition of Just Solutions. I'm your host, Gloria Neal. So this week, my guest knows all about the environment and what ails it, quite frankly. And by the end of the show, well, you're going to have a better idea as well. Marion G. is the co-executive director of the Climate Justice Alliance. So Marion, I want to thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
You are very welcome. So it has gone from a crisis to an emergency. A recently released report at the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in Switzerland calls on the urgency of now to aggressively begin taking action to reverse human-made damage to the ecosystem. Can you help the average person who's listening to this wrap their brain around that reality and what that means?
I think it's really important to understand that the root causes of the climate crisis aren't just greenhouse gas emissions. It's economic inequity, environmental injustice, systemic racism, exploitation of workers, communities, and the environment, a drive for unlimited economic growth, and the greenhouse gas emissions that then result from those activities. So I think it's really important for the average person to understand that's how we have gotten to this point, that the impacts are real. We're seeing polar vortexes, wildfires, increased hurricanes, and those that are impacted first and worst are frontline communities. So it's really important that the solutions come from those that are most impacted. And we need the average person, we need philanthropy, we need government at all levels, really investing in and following the lead of marginalized and disenfranchised communities.
That's very true. I mean, I was just sitting here thinking about the tornadoes that hit Mississippi and Kansas, and I mean, all the way through that whole swath of land, Tornado Alley, as they call it. But with the rate at which the tornadoes are dropping down in one day and then the next day the same thing, it's like Tornado Alley becomes tornado residence. I mean, it's like they are living in that part of the country, and you're seeing multiple disasters happen in a matter of a week in the same state. So what are your thoughts on companies who are beginning to harvest CO2 from the air and store it in underground wells or sell it to other companies? In other words, trying to do their part in helping Mother Earth help us.
I think the important thing to understand is that corporations are actually the reason we got into this mess. I named some of those root causes of climate change, and it's really important that we not look to them to regulate themselves or continue to regulate themselves. In the example of direct air capture, which is a part of geoengineering technology, we've seen even as recently as this fall articles coming out that show and demonstrate that they don't reduce emissions, they're a waste of money, they're risky and dangerous for all of our communities, and more importantly, they don't reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and they allow the oil and gas industry to continue to live on instead of making that transition to the renewable, to the regenerative economy that we need. In some ways, some of the subsidies that we're seeing are actually creating a perverse incentive. In order for companies to qualify for some of these subsidies, carbon dioxide must be produced, then captured and buried. So we're really not, again, going to those root causes, and we can't trust these polluting industries to get us out of the climate crisis that they caused in the first place. We really have to end the dig, burn, dump economy. We have to support workers in a just transition to new jobs. We have to repair the harms done to environmental justice communities. As you just mentioned, we didn't even talk about the multiple train derailments and toxic spills that are continuing to happen in environmental justice communities. And we have to reduce emissions in a significant way. And capturing carbon and putting it back into the ground is really not getting at those root causes. And we have to ask ourselves, when we hear solutions like this or propose corporate solutions like this, are they actually, who's actually benefiting in this case? When they are putting some technology on top of those smokestacks, it's allowing that corporation to continue to pollute and say that they're doing something for the community.
But Marion, when you look at all of these companies, who I agree, there's no such thing as self-regulation. You need an oversight that does not need to be connected to them in any way. But even though we look at things like trees, the nature surrounding the ecosystems being a significant part of this equation, are we not going to be able to plant our way out of this crisis? Because some people think, well, you just got to plant more trees. You say what?
I think that the solution is intersectional and systemic, and that's why we're organizing for a just transition, not simply a transition. We need, for in the example of government, and that's federal, state, municipal, we really need to stop focusing on funding these false solutions like carbon removal, hydrogen. There are billions of dollars that are going into these techno fixes that are really just a distraction. We really need to expand and replicate community-controlled renewables and other forms of energy and economic systems that prioritize equity, justice, and prevent further harm. For philanthropy, what we're seeing is that we need to really recognize where the wealth of these foundations is coming from. It's coming from an extractive capitalist system where they are able to accumulate wealth through forced and stolen labor, stolen land, and they continue to harm people on the planet. And even as they say they value climate solutions and want to invest in BIPOC communities and BIPOC-led organizations, we know that only about 1.3% of climate funding is actually going to BIPOC-led organizations who are on the front lines of the climate crisis. Furthermore, foundations have about $1.2 trillion in philanthropic investments. That means they're investing in the stock market, which oftentimes is continuing to further the climate crisis or deepen the climate crisis. So Climate Justice Alliance and a lot of our allies and members are really pushing on philanthropy to not only align their grant making, which is very important to BIPOC-led communities, to frontline organizations, but also to move their investments out of the stock market and into regenerative solutions like community-controlled capital financial vehicles, which I can talk a little bit more about. And we even call on mainstream environmental organizations to please remember that nothing about us without us. The MES principles of democratic organizing and our people solutions lens are really great tools that you can find on our website that can help mainstream environmental organizations really start to change their practices, bring environmental justice, communities, and leadership into your governance, into your design and planning at the very start, and really meaningfully fund their collaboration because they're already making a regenerative economy happen on the ground in their communities, and we need support from those large organizations, from philanthropy, from government, from everyone.
Yeah, I can definitely tell you that Europe is head and shoulders above where we are. Many countries in Europe are as it relates to this issue because it's not a political issue for them. It is about survival, right? It is surviving. Everybody on this big blue planet, you've got to do something. And starting those steps, let's talk about some of the solutions, and you alluded to it. So I want to talk about some of the things that the Climate Justice Alliance is involved in. But more importantly, what can the average person do right now? Are they recycling at home? Do they drive a hybrid, or should they drive an electric car? Or should they be demanding that their company fill in the blank as it relates to the climate emergency that's taking place in the world?
That's a great question. I think that something the average person needs to be reminded is that oil and gas companies have known since, I think, the 1970s that they were causing the climate crisis. And so they've been very effective in spinning and reinforcing the ideas that you as an individual, as an average person, must take individual action and responsibility. And this is very intentional. But what we need to be doing is holding corporations and government accountable. That could be done through some individual action, but it's really systemic change that is going to make the difference in the climate crisis. So I think that I would encourage folks to find organizations like Climate Justice Alliance nationally, find them in your community. We have a list on our website of all of our members across the country, climatejusticealliance.org. You can join our mailing list, you can join our newsletter. There's so many different things that you could be doing, but I think the main thing to focus on is joining a community of folks that are holding your government, whether that's your local, your state, the federal government, accountable and working in community to make sure that we're actually making a systemic shift. It shouldn't be upon you to fix this problem that we're in by buying an electric vehicle. It should be upon all of us to hold corporations and government accountable for the historic harm that they've done and to help us build the regenerative future that we need and deserve.
You know, before we talk about the businesses and different areas that we can kind of tap into, I definitely want to make sure that I give you an opportunity to elaborate on what you just stated, because more times than not, we don't hear the answer which you just gave, which is a very good one, and that is, what about these corporations who are doing these things that are harming the earth en masse? Let's get them to reverse some of that, right? And own that responsibility before you and I go out and, you know, as one person has alluded to, trying to give a whale a tic tac. That's really not going to help with their breath, right? But if you look at corporations, you look at how much they produce and how many people are impacted, they really need to take the lead, is what you're saying.
I think there's a couple steps we need to take. I think, again, the government, it plays an important role in regulating and providing opportunities for businesses to do the right thing, while also putting out regulation to enforce them when they're not doing the right thing, such as polluting. So I think that's a really, really important part of addressing this. I think for businesses in their own practices, I find our just transition framework to be a really useful and simple tool that, again, you can find on our website. I think that that framework really pushes businesses to think about our relationship to the environment, our communities, and to each other. It asks folks to start thinking about, are you taking intentional steps towards a regenerative economy? Are you asking deep questions about ownership, decision-making, profits? Are you sharing power and building wealth with workers and community members, or at their expense? What are the true impacts of business decisions and practices? At the end of the day, we believe that a just transition away from the fossil fuel, away from the extractive economy, requires businesses, organizations, institutions at all levels to really model shifting economic control to communities, ensuring democratic wealth at the workplace, advancing ecological restoration, driving racial justice and social equity, relocalizing production and consumption, and retaining and restoring cultures and traditions. And I think one really great example of a business like that is one of our members, Tierra y Libertad, is a 65-acre farm worker cooperative located in Bellingham, Washington, that emerged in 2017 from a boycott of farm workers seeking unionization. This cooperative provided farm workers a means to work without the harsh conditions of field managers or risk their health working with pesticides or under harsh conditions, as we have seen with the climate crisis. And more importantly, it's not a standalone cooperative. They're working with other organizations to change the future of what farm work looks like in the community, what business looks like in the community. They have a goal of trying to shift 25% of the local economy to cooperatives so that the farm workers can meet their own needs, their own efforts in the local community, and they don't have to rely on these large multinational global corporations that prioritize profits over people and the planet. So that's just one example of what that could look like.
Since there's a lot of talk about corporations, what they're doing, what they're not doing, can you speak a little bit to the history of the incentivizing versus the penalizing of corporations?
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit, at least in terms of oil and gas. We've seen decades of fossil fuel subsidies to support their continued operation. And I think that it needs to be reversed. We need to the government needs to take a do not harm approach. Right now, corporations, not even just around climate change, but in a lot of different sectors, have to prove that they're actually harming someone before the government does anything about that. And I think we need to flip that. I think corporations actually need to prove that they aren't doing any harm before they can actually implement their business or, expand their business. And I think that We just need to turn that on its head. The government continues to subsidize the solutions that we don't want to see. In the case of the Inflation Reduction Act, we see billions of dollars going to hydrogen, propane, other types of fossil fuel related solutions. Like, this is only going to maintain and expand fossil fuel infrastructure. This isn't going to transition us to a regenerative, renewable future.
So how much will the government and should the government play a role in this? And I ask that because there seems to be a big backlash against, anything government led right now. And also, the government may not lead the way, but should they begin requiring more of manufacturers? And I mean really requiring it.
Yes, I think the backlash is because the government is protecting the 1% and corporations and not the people, and not those who are being harmed and oppressed. And you're seeing that across so many different issues. We're here talking about climate, but I could say the same for reproductive rights, gun control, the list goes on. So I think that it's really important that we remind ourselves that the government should be protecting those marginalized, those oppressed, by setting and enforcing regulations. And that includes on corporations, because in the case, what we're talking about here today, climate change, they're the ones that created this crisis that we're in. So we do need to regulate them, and they need to pay. They need to pay to remediate the lands that they've poisoned and the communities that they've poisoned. And they really need to answer to those questions and really rethink their business practices, because this economy is killing all of us.
Right, right. And with that statement, if you think about it, because as you talk about, no, the corporations really need to step up and reverse a lot of this, because they do it in mass. In other words, they hurt the planet in mass. And so theirs is going to have a greater impact than, say, you, me, and 6 or 7 other people. But that does not negate or prevent us, or it doesn't and shouldn't dissuade us from still doing our part as citizens, right?
Correct. I think part of our duty as citizens is to hold our elected officials accountable. That could mean participating in a direct action with one of the member organizations that I mentioned before. That could mean joining a protest. That could mean voting. That could mean joining any of the many organizations that are trying to ensure that justice and equity are a core part of our local regenerative economies. So yes, we have to be showing up, because we can't rely on corporations and the government as now to do what needs to be done.
Absolutely. And things even like, joining a solar co-op, or making sure, even as we look at our homes, composting and, recycle. Every little bit in that sense helps. But how does the average person, because you touched on the corporations, but how do they really begin this complex journey and not be overwhelmed? Because each one can do something, but everybody can't do everything.
That's right. I think that's so why organizations like Climate Justice Alliance, but also organizations that are tackling any number of issues, as I said, the climate crisis is caused by so many intersecting issues: racial justice, economic justice. So that's why it's so important to get involved in local organizations that are not just supporting folks in need, but actively organizing to get solutions passed that change the system. And that's what I think the average person could be doing, whether that's, again, getting onto the mailing list, volunteering, getting involved in these organizations. That's how we're going to build power. And that's how we're going to really see the shifts, the systemic shifts, the change in policies and regulations and laws, the investment, and so much more, is when we band together to build power and demand what we need.
I think the imagination of the average person is like, okay, we're in an emergency. What does that really mean? Is the air going to go away? Is the severity of, you fill in the blank, whether it is weather, whether it is being on a train, whether it's being, on a plane, what does that look like? What I'm really getting at, Marion, is what do we do or say or show to get them to vote, to participate in holding those corporations accountable, to making sure that they are a part of the solution and not the problem. At the very micro level, what can we do for our neighbors, for ourselves? What can we do?
And I know this is so hard, but again, I think going to our website and starting to ask the questions, like as you see solutions coming up, even in your neighborhood, at your city council level, I think making sure we're always asking the critical questions: who's telling the story, who's making the decisions, who's benefiting, and how, what else will this impact, and how does this build or shift power? I think that what corporations and our government and sometimes even our culture do is tend to divide us, or tend to think that everything, that we have to pick ourselves up from our bootstraps, that everything that we're doing is because of our own personal choices. And I think what Climate Justice Alliance, our members, and so many other organizing groups across the country are trying to show is like that's actually not the case. Like, we need to build community together, we need to be in conversation together, we need to be asking these critical questions, we need to be organizing, and we need to be pushing corporations, our local governments, the federal government, to not be a shield for corporations anymore, to hold them accountable, to create and enforce regulations, and to support the nascent projects that I just listed, or I named. Tierra y Libertad is one example. I'll give another example. In Uprose, the oldest Latino community organization in Brooklyn, organized the first New York City community-owned solar farm right in their neighborhood to lower energy costs for residents. So that's the power of joining a community organization like that, is that you are collectivizing your power and you are fighting for and winning the kinds of solutions that we need to see to address the climate crisis. And we need philanthropy, we need big organizations, we need government to support these kinds of projects that are really intersectional, that are community led, that are rebuilding community wealth. Because I think what part of this backlash is that people don't have the time, the resources to track all of this, because we've been so divided. We've allowed ourselves to be so divided. And the real solution, again, I think, is really to find community and to organize together to win these kinds of solutions that we need.
You know what? I love those solutions, Marion. I love, love, love them, because it really does not only tell us, but it gives us a very good starting place, one that we can certainly embrace during this time of divisiveness, right? Everything is so divisive, and it's you, no, it's me, and it's, all of those things, whether it's a political front or whether it's even in our legislature, in our House, whether it is local, state, or federal. It makes a huge difference when you have people who normally would not get involved saying, okay, this is enough, and recognizing it's not going to change until the average person does get involved. So thank you for coming on Just Solutions. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. And I would just remind all the folks that are watching that you're not alone. And please do find those local grassroots organizing groups or join the Climate Justice Alliance, because we can win this together.
Absolutely. Give your website, Marion.
ClimateJusticeAlliance.org.
Thank you so much again. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us on this edition of Just Solutions. There's so much that each of us can do. Every week we try to give just solutions on some of the more serious problems that are ailing not just this country, but the world. Until next week, I'm your host, Gloria Neal. This is Just Solutions.